Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Big Easy Sports Talk podcast. My name is Nick Garisco, and I'm here with Michael Pelichan. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you like what you hear today, please subscribe to this podcast and give us a great rating on iTunes. As always, you can tweet us your questions using the hashtag BestQuestions, and we'll debate them live in the fourth quarter of each show. Today, we're going to recap the NFL Combine and discuss whether the drills actually translate to the next level. We're going to be talking about some LSU prospects and some Combine winners, and we'll also get into the Pelicans signifying that they are going to shut it down. And, of course, we're going to tackle your best questions, including who the Saints should target in free agency and our favorite AD moments. But let's kick off with the story of the week, and that's that the NFL Combine occurred. And that kind of signals that it's NFL draft season, and obviously that's one of my favorite seasons of the entire year. And for those of you who are not familiar with the NFL Combine, 327 invited NFL prospects go to Indianapolis to perform a series of athletic tests. And I'm really excited to dive into this today.
Yeah, so about the Combine, do you think it's actually something that matters a whole lot, or do you think it's somewhat irrelevant in terms of what will actually translate to the next level?
I think the Combine is extremely important, but it's not necessarily for what we're seeing on TV. Because before all of the athletic tests and positional drills that we go through, that we watch as fans, they do a lot of things behind the scenes that are arguably, I would say definitely actually more important to NFL teams. First, you have your verified measurements. And, Kyler Murray, the quarterback who's projected to go number 1 overall, he kind of made waves there when he measured in at 5'10". A lot of people thought he was going to be 5'8" or something like that, which would be crazy for a quarterback to go number 1 when he's 5'8". But he kind of won that there with 5'10". But not only they're measuring height, they're also measuring weight, which is important for offensive, defensive linemen. And they're also measuring things like arm length and wingspan, which can be very important for defensive linemen and receivers. They're also doing medical evaluations, which are so crucial. And this is arguably the most important aspect of the Combine that a lot of people don't realize because it's behind closed doors. And you see, guys, this is a very thorough medical examination. Every part of the body and even the inside of your body. Last year, Maurice Hurst, for example, they found out that he was playing with a very critical heart condition, and he fell to the 5th round of the draft when the Raiders took him. And you see players all the time fall, a couple rounds and then where they're projected or slotted to go by the analysts and experts. And a lot of reasons for that is we find out after, maybe 2 months later, that, the guy had knee tendonitis or something like that. Something popped up in his medical evaluation. They also do drug testing and they do Combine interviews. Each team has 60 interviews to go through, 60 interviews to choose which player they want to interview. And those can be very extensive.
Yeah, so when you say interviews, what exactly do you mean by that? Because when I'm thinking of an interview, I would hope that they would have a chance to do something kind of like what Gruden did. He would sit down with quarterbacks and he'd sort of go through some film and say, what were you thinking here? What do you see here? Or stuff like that. Is it like that at all? Or is it just something where they're just sitting down in the middle of an open field or an open room and talking?
Well, the Combine interviews actually take place in a hotel, in physical hotel rooms that you and I, have come to stay at. But they have about 7 or 8 team members, the team brass, if you will. And the answer to your question, though, is yes. Especially for quarterbacks, these interviews can be very extensive, and a lot of them can be about memorization. The interviews are very important. They draw up plays on a little blackboard or a white dry erase board, and they'll ask the quarterback, a couple of minutes later, maybe even at the end of the interview, to kind of relay what the responsibilities were for each play or terminology of the playbook, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes teams will use one of their 60 interviews to get intel on other players, maybe other players who are a specific prospect's teammate. For example, if you have Nick Bosa, who's supposed to go number 2 overall, the 49ers, and you're sitting there in the teens, you have no shot at Nick Bosa. But maybe you want to find out information about his quarterback, what Nick Bosa actually thinks about Dwayne Haskins, for example, of Ohio State. They played together. And maybe you want to figure out what he thinks of his quarterback, whether he's a great leader, what he's done to build up the team. If you're interested in Dwayne Haskins, you can interview a guy like Nick Bosa and see kind of how his teammates felt about him, which can be very valuable answers that you wouldn't necessarily get from Haskins himself, who's just going to say all the right things about himself, of course. It goes even further, like they'll start talking about, or they'll interview players just to see tendencies of their opponent. So a lot of people don't realize that, like, let's say Kyler Murray's supposed to go number 1 overall, and let's say the Seattle Seahawks will interview him knowing that the Cardinals have the number 1 pick and knowing that they're about to face this quarterback 2 times a year for the next at least 5 years, could be for the next decade. So they will ask Kyler Murray, for example, what's your biggest weaknesses? What coverages do you hate? And they'll try to get some intel out of him, just kind of a scouting report to see how they can attack him later in his career.
You said this earlier in another podcast. You said that basically they don't have a long shelf life, coaches and GMs, but I also wonder how much of it is they might have a guy that they're not in a position to get, but they might be looking down the road and thinking, I'd at least like to know what this guy's about, and maybe this is someone who could be a long-term fit after his first contract ends and stuff like that. Like I think at some level they have to be preparing for not just the immediate future, but also way down the line.
Right. I mean, most of these guys' contracts, unless you're a first-rounder where you have that 5th-year option, most of these guys' contracts who are drafted are 4 years, and there's definitely been examples of teams that will interview a certain player and kind of keep those notes on hand in their organization. And when that player becomes a free agent in 4 years, they can kind of go back and evaluate those notes and see if he's going to be a good fit with the team.
Yeah, definitely. And let's talk about the actual drills now. Because first of all, inform me on how many drills are there, and then kind of if we could go one by one and go into what goes into each drill, and then also what you're looking for as a quote unquote coach or GM or whatever.
There are 7 athletic drills in the athletic tests, if you will, in the combine. But let's remember that there's also positional drills that aren't measured. For example, when you see receivers doing the gauntlet, which is when they, Odell Beckham was famous for kind of dominating the gauntlet. He was just so smooth of an athlete. Like, that's when they're running in the straight line and you see them catching passes from different directions and they have to keep that straight line. That's the gauntlet, which is kind of probably the hardest receiver test that they do. And you always see defensive backs, that's another common one that they'll show on TV where they have to backpedal and you see how smooth their hip transition is, see how quickly they can backpedal, and see how they can change directions and then go catch a deep ball in the air at its highest point. So there are a lot of positional drills, but like you said, most people, most fans at least, really want to see how these guys really test athletically. And it's usually from tests that are more relatable to the common fan, like the 40-yard dash.
Yeah, so let's start with the 40-yard dash, because that's honestly the one that you hear the most about, because people always like to see someone go 4.3 or sub 4.3 if that happens, which doesn't happen a whole lot. But I mean, so go into what is it supposed to measure, and then also how much does it actually translate into NFL performance?
It's supposed to measure straight line speed, and I would argue a little bit of acceleration. But keep in mind that context is very important for the 40-yard dash and for all these drills, because when you have a guy who's, let's say a receiver, for example, who's 6'4", 235 pounds, who's running the same 40 time or a similar 40 time than a receiver who's 5'9", 165 pounds, that really says a lot about the bigger receiver and how explosive that he can be when you add that size component to it. And unfortunately, these are just raw numbers, and you can't really judge just the sole times based on everything that encompasses the athletic profile of that player. I mean, you're all doing this to get data, but as far as the 40-yard dash goes, it's really just to measure straight line speed, but it's important to keep in mind the size of the players running this. I would argue that a lot of teams focus on the 10-yard and 20-yard split of the 40-yard dash even more so than the 40 yards itself. You're going to see teams really want to see that straight line speed for defensive backs, like cornerbacks and receivers. But for offensive linemen, it's more about that 10-yard and 20-yard split, because you're never really in a position when you're an offensive guard where you're running 40 yards downfield in a straight line sprint.
Yeah, and even if you're a receiver like running a go route, if you get jammed at the line, like you can talk about guys who are super, super fast, but if they get any contact and they can't get into their stride quickly, I mean, like those are the kinds of things where you can only simulate so much in those drills, and like a 40-yard dash might indicate some sort of blazing speed that doesn't necessarily mean it translates to on-field performance.
Right. It might take you a while to get to your top-end speed. And I know 40-yard dash is one of the more popular drills. People like to see people's 40 time because I think it's relatable as a fan. Like a lot of fans, ran a 40 in high school for some sport that they did or something like that. And they just like to judge these guys with their 40s. But the 3-cone drill and I would argue a lot of the other drills are more about short area speed or change of directions to judge kind of elusiveness in the open field, or in measuring kind of a stop-start kind of situation rather than straight line speed of the 40-yard dash.
Yes, I mean, talk about like you talked about a lot of these, but go into like, so what is a 3-cone drill? Like, what is the setup of that, and then which particular positions does it tend to be the most important?
Well, it's an L-shaped drill. Each cone is about 5 yards. It's basically 3 sprints of 5 yards in kind of an L shape. And that's one of the more important drills, I would say, especially for pass rushers. To be honest, Michael, there's not a lot of high correlations between these drills from an individual standpoint, these drills in positional success on the field in the NFL. But one of the drills that does have a high correlation to success is the 3-cone drill for pass rushers. And it makes sense. They're starting with their hand in the ground, and they have to do 3 sprints of 5 yards in different directions. And that kind of measures your ability to change directions, and it also kind of measures your get off, your explosiveness. So pass rushers, 3-cone drill, that's kind of what I'm looking for there.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that if I were looking at this, I would say you're just getting more data, and I think it might be really, really useful if you've already seen it for a player like, let's just say in the SEC or something like that. Like, you already know that person can compete at a really high level, will probably translate pretty well to the NFL, versus someone who's a D2, D3 player, someone who they might be playing against people who are slower, not as athletic, and it might be harder to gauge actually how athletic they are, and this might be the first chance to validate that versus someone where you've seen enough on film where it's pretty obvious that they're going to translate well.
Absolutely. That's a great point, because what happens is you'll have these small school guys who go to Murray State or something, they'll be dominating their competition, and you want to see them at least perform with these SEC guys or these Power 5 conference guys on a level playing field, at least measuring them up as athletes to see if they're a similar athlete or to see if maybe not. And again, that brings another point. It's very important that the combine, it's not necessarily about taking one drill. It's about taking the whole athletic profile and then seeing how it measures up or how it compares to what they show on film. The film, their college production and their college film is going to be the most important part of an evaluation. But you're using their results of the combine to go and see if it matches the film. And if it doesn't, like let's say a guy who really stood out on film doesn't test well athletically, or vice versa. Let's say a guy who really didn't show. Yeah. You see that more often, where the guy who you weren't even thinking about going into the combine, all of a sudden is this combine warrior where he's dominating all these athletic tests. And a lot of it goes into how much these players train for specific tests. But overall, when you include all the drills together, it's a decent athletic profile, but I do think a lot of areas could be changed and maybe improved.
I wonder too if they might, so let's just say coaches or GMs might notice someone who, you sort of said it earlier, someone who didn't perform particularly well in college, but then really test out well at the combine, and maybe they're seeing that as, maybe it hasn't immediately impacted their performance on the actual field, but maybe they have some sort of raw material that could be harnessed in a different way or something like that, where it's some indicator of raw ability that can be, if it's put in the right kind of what's the word for it,
situation,
system or whatever,
exactly.
or just like some sort of training, this guy he explodes a little bit wrong, he does something a little bit different than he should be, and if we change this, then this, and sort of those kinds of logical trains of analysis.
Right, and there's the vertical jump or the vertical leap, if you will, and that's a very common one for fans too. People like to know how high players jump, and that really does measure kind of lower body explosiveness. it's kind of tied to, I would say, pass rushers and running backs, I would say. I know a lot of people like to think that receivers, need to be able to jump high, or defensive backs, but there's really no real correlation there with success in the NFL. And then the broad jump is another jump, and that's where you're standing still and you're jumping horizontally. And that also is another indicator of kind of lower body explosion and strength and balance in your hips. A lot of these drills, I know that the 40-yard dash and maybe the bench press and the vertical jump have the highest pedigree, if you will. I think a lot of people care about them the most. But really, again, a lot of these drills are measuring just short area quickness. And that's something, like you said, if you find a player who's kind of a diamond in the rough there, maybe you can, coach other aspects of his game where he was kind of flawed in college. You can coach him up to be a good NFL player if he's put in the right system.
So all those drills that you talked about, there really is only one that seems to be a pure strength drill, and that's the bench press. So to talk to me a little bit about that, what is that supposed to be measuring?
It's supposed to test upper body strength. The bench press has gotten a lot of critiques actually in the last couple of years because not only have we seen guys kind of tear their pectoral muscles when they're doing it, but also I would argue that squats are probably just as important. I mean, because if you're going to test upper body, then you might as well upper body strength. You might as well test lower body strength because the bench press is. There's not many times, you could argue maybe offensive linemen, but there's not many times when a player actually uses the motion of a bench press, in an actual football game. I get that it's a measurement of upper body strength, and that's good. But I think that they should either add squats to it or just take out the bench press completely. Although I will say this, though. This is what I like. This is what I get out of the bench press. I think that it shows that at least a prospect is pretty familiar with the weight room. You know what I'm saying, Michael? Like if you have I'm not really so much judging like how much they're lifting 225 pounds. Like if one guy is, doing 5 reps fewer of that, it's not a huge concern. But when you have a linebacker, for example, who goes in and does the bench press, and he only reps, let's say 10 reps or something like that, probably just natural strength, it is kind of alarming to me and to potentially other GMs out there that, okay, this guy doesn't really spend a lot of time in the weight room, and that's concerning. Because I will say this about the bench press, even though it's not very translative to football, it is one of the main, it's one of the bench press and squats are two of the primary workouts that you do in a weight room, if you're playing football throughout your life. So it is kind of alarming sometimes when players do have a abnormally low bench press amount. And I think that's what you can use it for. As long as you meet that threshold, I do think it's one of the weaker drills in terms of, I guess weak is a wrong word, but I think it's one of the least important drills, I guess. I'd rather see squats there, actually.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, because especially since you're not really you're always using your legs in some form or fashion when you're doing and obviously you're using your upper body too, but
right.
You're using both together. You shouldn't just isolate one and say, well, that's it. I mean, because that's not. Yeah, I think it should be both. It makes sense. For this quarter, or at least for the next quarter, let's talk more about individual players because you've kind of gone into the different drills and what you're looking for. But I want to know, at least from the combine, who did really well, who didn't do well, how the LSU players did, and all of that stuff.
Are you looking for something fun to do this weekend? Make the drive to the Instigator Ranch and Hatchery in Covington, Louisiana. Home of more than 2,000 alligators, a guided tour gives you the opportunity to observe and learn all about these unique creatures. You can hold small alligators and alligator eggs in your hands while a baby gator hatches from it. Seriously, it's incredibly wild. These tours are year-round and under $20. The Instigator Ranch has 4.8 stars on Yelp and is 99% rated on Groupon. Experience the life of Louisiana's most ancient residents. Check out the Instigator Ranch in Covington.
So Nick, tell me first of all, if there's one person you had to pick from the entire combine who was the quote-unquote winner, who would it be?
Montez Sweat, defensive end out of Mississippi State, did himself a lot of favors in this combine. He was viewed as a late first-round draft pick by many of the analysts, and now a lot of the big guys are putting him in the top 5, number 5 to Tampa Bay, or even 6 to the New York Giants. So Montez Sweat's a guy who really improved his draft stock, I would say, because now that he has these great athletic measurables and he just did so well at the combine, I think teams will be able to draft him or feel good about drafting him early. And again, it's a guy, like you said, like you mentioned earlier, a guy that they can harness those athletic skills and turn them into, quality football production. DK Metcalf is another guy, I would say, Ole Miss receiver. He did really well at the combine. He showed up huge, looking bigger and faster than Julio Jones. I will say that he struggled in the 3-cone and short shuttle. He had some of the worst times there, but he pretty much dominated in every other aspect. I mean, the guy is just humongous. So I think teams will like that, assuming that he passes his drug test, which I don't think is an assumption we should maybe make. But then Andre Dillard, he's boring offensive tackle. He's out of Washington, but I do think that if there's any offensive lineman who dominated the combine, it was him. I think he'll be a top 15 pick overall, and he was kind of viewed as not even a first-round pick a couple of weeks ago. And then lastly, Noah Fant, tight end out of Iowa. A lot of people thought that TJ Hawkinson was going to be the guy at tight end this year, and now I kind of think that they're going to be drafted around the same area, and that's like the mid-first round.
Yeah, talk about, you just said something about a tight end. How about Foster Moreau, man?
Yeah.
4.66,
wow.
And then a 4.11 in the short shuttle. That was kind of crazy. I mean, were you expecting anything like that?
No, not at all, honestly.
Does that kind of blow you away?
I think that he was one of the bigger surprises of the combine. I don't know how much it's going to affect his draft stock just because his production was so minimal at LSU. I think his best season at LSU, and he's a graduating senior, I think his best season was 24 catches and maybe 3 touchdowns or something like that. And this guy showed up at the combine. Well, I will say, this is after a great Senior Bowl that he had a couple months ago. He was named one of the most outstanding players there. He showed up. He had a 36-inch vertical. He showed up at 6'4", 253 pounds, which is great size for a tight end. He did 22 reps on the bench press, which is just a little more than I could do. Just joking. And then he also ran a 4.66, like you said, which was 5th among all tight ends. And like you mentioned, this is a guy who was just really under the radar. I don't think anyone really expected him to go out there and perform as one of the most athletic tight ends in all the combine. I definitely think that teams are going back and watching his film, even with the limited sample size that he had. Maybe it'll be like a Darius Geis situation, not catching the ball, or LSU running backs not catching the ball. Maybe it was just a thing to where tight ends weren't really used a lot in the passing game for LSU. So I think a team is definitely going to draft him as kind of a athletic project that they can work around.
Okay, let's talk about Devin White and Greedy Williams a little bit, because that was probably a much more anticipated performance from those two guys than it was from Moreau. So, I mean, did they perform as they should have? Were they better? Were they worse?
Yeah.
I mean, do you feel like that they actually changed their draft positions whatsoever?
I don't think they changed their draft positions. I do think they solidified their draft positions, if that makes sense. I think most people thought Devin White and Greedy Williams were going to be top 25 picks. I think a lot of people even thought Devin White was going to be a top 10 pick. I see Devin White as more of a I would say 7 to 15 range, and I see Greedy Williams as a top 20 pick now. I think he really solidified his draft stock. All Greedy Williams did was run a strong 40 at 4.37, and that's at 6'2", 185. So he gave teams. He measured in with great size for a cornerback, 6'2". I mean, that's awesome. And he ran fast, and that's probably the most important drill for a cornerback. So I think he really solidified himself as a top 20 overall pick. And Devin White, we know how athletic Devin White is. He's a sideline-to-sideline linebacker. He's very explosive. He had a 4.42 yard, 40-yard dash, almost a 40-inch vertical. Good broad jump, above average 3-cone, above average 20-yard shuttle for a linebacker. I know he is a little undersized at 6'0", 237, but that's kind of how the linebackers are getting smaller now, man. The linebackers really have to be able to cover now, tight ends. The teams are passing more. There's not really a huge market for those old-fashioned big thumpers who are playing on first and second down, who mainly just clog up the running game. Now, Devin White is like the prototypical NFL linebacker right now. He reminds me of a better version of Deion Jones, who came out of LSU a couple of years ago, who plays for the Falcons. So if there's any knock on Devin White, I would say that the only score below his, I would guess his average was his bench press. It was he did 22 reps there. I would have expected more along the 25, 26 range, but that's really, really nitpicking. And like I said, 22 reps, you can tell he's in the workout room, the weight room, so it's not really a concern with me.
Okay. Any finishing thoughts before we move on to the Pelicans?
No, I've seen Devin White pretty much mocked as high as Tampa Bay at 5 overall. I'm looking around that Cincinnati range at pick 11. That's kind of where I see him going. I'm rooting for him. Devin White's such a great player at LSU. I almost wish he would have stayed, but he did the right thing by coming out. Before we start the next quarter, guys, there's a difference between having insurance and actually being insured. If you want to feel secure about the things you care about most, State Farm agent Josh Loranda will have you covered. Over 10 years of experience, quality customer service, great communication, and no gimmicks. His branch is located right here in Mid-City, New Orleans, and he's my go-to for auto, homeowners, life, flood, and renters insurance. Do something today that your future self will thank you for. You can email Josh directly at josh@sfmidcity.com for a free quote. Or you can find him on Facebook at Josh Lorando State Farm Agent. Josh Lorando, State Farm Agent. All right, this third quarter, we got to talk about the Pelicans here because it seems like they're showing the tendencies of a team that's shutting down. Jrue Holiday, lower ab strain. He'll be, quote-unquote, evaluated in 7 to 10 days. Etuan Moore, left quad contusion. I want to get your take on whether you think these are kind of the nails in the coffin, if you will, for the Pelicans to just admit that they are shutting it down, i.e. tanking.
I think the goal was always, like they said, as soon as the All-Star break was over, Danny Ferry was saying how we need to focus on the development of our young players, and that's sort of code word for tanking. We did enough to where we could be losing some valuable positioning if we don't do this. So I'm not surprised. There are actually a few teams within a game or two of us. Actually, we have more losses, but we have within one win of looks like 4 other teams right now.
Wow.
And that, yeah. So I mean, like it's not going to make a gigantic difference, but it's going to make a somewhat tangible difference. And I think it's something to where you shouldn't be taking chances. And I think that in terms of Jrue Holiday, obviously Drew's going to be sticking around. Drew's great, but if he's at all banged up, you sit him out for both the purposes of tanking and for the purposes of protecting his health. Davis, like you were saying, he played 21 minutes a night, so kind of going with the theme that's been going on for a while. Anytime he'll get dinged up, they'll sit him, that's for sure. And then Frank Jackson's picking up a lot of minutes right now, and I think that's something that's really good to be seeing.
Yeah, I was going to ask about how it kind of opens the door for guys like Frank Jackson, who did play well tonight. And Ian Clark is another guy that we haven't really talked about a lot. I want to get your take on Frank Jackson, Ian Clark, and if we have time here, I'd like to get your take on the new, I think he's a European guy, Darius Bertans, and I'd love to get your take on how this opens the door for those guys.
Yeah, I think you're talking about there are 240 minutes available to your team in an NBA game. So obviously one person's taking them, someone else is missing them. So even if Drew's playing 25 to 30 minutes a night and you knock that out entirely, you're splitting those minutes among other people. So I like it. I think it's the right move. I think we talked about Frank Jackson a little bit the last couple times, and I think I'm actually a little surprised that I went back and checked some of the statistics on it, and he's finishing a lot better at the rim than I thought he was. I think that's something that I still have some questions about him attacking NBA length. I think it's very different from him getting a layup versus his own position. And if there's someone where if he's attacking the rim, there's an actual big there, an actual big with any length whatsoever. I think the way that he has to alter his shot to get his shot off is not ideal. I think, again, he really needs to work on his change of pace. I think he's going to really need to harness more of a floater game. I think he's going to have to be able to shift directions really well. So all those things I think he needs to work on. Clark to me is who he is. I think Clark works hard. He comes off screens pretty hard. I think he's someone who can heat up and score a lot for you in a few minutes, but he's never really he's just not someone I want getting a lot of NBA minutes.
Do you think he has a future with the Pelicans, or what's his contract situation like?
I mean, so I don't know if he has a long-term future with the Pelicans. I think, like most of the other people on this team, they're all really replaceable. Drew Holiday is not replaceable. Anthony Davis is not replaceable. You can make an argument that Julius Randle could become a player who would not be replaceable. I don't know if he's there yet. But I think for the most part, most of the players on our team are not that outstanding outside of Drew and Davis. And I think there's not really. I mean, like, it's not an insult. I mean, I think it's
I got
like what
you.
you're looking for right now. Like with Bertrand. So like he's got a brother in the NBA right now. I think what you're looking for is you're looking for anybody that you can give minutes to, see what sticks. Maybe he's supposed to be a really great 3-point shooter. I'm not going to pretend like I watched him in Europe, but I think it's something to where, it's maybe he does stick, and maybe he becomes a rotation player for us for a few years, and then he might be out the door in a few years anyway. Like, you're just looking for any NBA talent at cheap NBA prices that you can keep so that you can spend more elsewhere, and I think that's exactly what they're doing right now.
One of the players that we are developing is Cheikh Diallo, and he had a great dunk the other day.
I mean, I don't know how much I love it, him putting his hand behind his head and dunking in an NBA game, especially when, to me, there was no doubt we were going to wind up losing that game because the Raptors are just so much better. But I got to be honest, I think it's really funny, and I like how enthusiastic he seems to be. Like, he does his finger wags when he blocks shots. He did the mailman dunk like you're talking about. I think it's nice to see that he's having fun out there, and obviously he's working very hard. Sometimes he's working to his own detriment because he's not working in the right ways, but there are things to like, and we've talked plenty about Diallo and how there's a lot of raw ability there, but it kind of is without a true position in the NBA, and he might be sort of being phased out by small ball fours and stuff like that. He doesn't really have a traditional game for an NBA four at this point. He's not really big enough to play the five, so those are the things that I would be looking for him. But you know what? And we talked about, you were mentioning against the Raptors, and I honestly, when I was watching that game, I was watching Pascal Siakam, and I was thinking, I love everything that the Raptors have done. So Masai Ujiri came over a few years ago from Denver. I don't know why he left there. I think they fired him, but they shouldn't have. He was doing an awesome job there. And the Raptors have just done an awesome job putting together a roster. So if you look at a lot of their players, they've either gotten them through the draft or they've traded for them, including this year with Kawhi and Danny Green. And to me, they're almost a perfect case of what I would like the Pelicans to be.
So the Raptors weren't your stereotypical Philadelphia 76ers where they actively tanked for a really long time, really trying to secure these high draft picks, and were able to get guys like Ben Simmons or Joel Embiid. What did the Raptors kind of do differently to get where they are now? And we're talking about a very successful franchise, by the way. I know they haven't won a championship, or in a while at least, but they are always in it. They are always very, very competitive. They're always making the playoffs, and they're usually one of the top 3 or 4 seeds. So what did the Raptors do differently that maybe we can copy?
I think they draft really well, and I think they do a really, really good job of player development. We can talk a little bit about the different methods of player development. I think there are some players, no matter where you put them, they would be very, very good. I think that was probably true of most NBA stars, that they would be there no matter what the circumstances were. But I also think there are guys where if they're not really ready to get NBA minutes, they might really have a bunch of skills, but not any of them that are good enough to really I should say become a specialist at that moment. But then what they'll do is, instead of trying to make them a jack of all trades, they'll wind up saying, look, hey, for right now, work on this one skill.
Right.
And once you get that, that's all you're going to do. Like, you're going to become a great defender. You're going to become whatever. So Siakam, man, that guy was running up and down the floor. I haven't watched him a whole lot. He was everywhere in transition. He's long. He's athletic. He wasn't a guy who had a lot of fanfare coming into the league. I just think they have done an awesome job of drafting, awesome job of developing their young players, and look at their stars. I mean, like, a lot of them have been traded there, and that's because they had affordable players who were very good as well, and they collected a lot of really good assets and exchanged them well. And that, to me, is exactly how I'd want to run my NBA franchise. I don't care if they've won a championship. They've been really, really good, like you said, for several years now, for I think 6 or 7 years. And that to me is the blueprint for what I want to be doing moving forward.
Right, and the expectations are even lower here in New Orleans, which is not really a basketball city, but we would be very happy to just be competing. Even if we don't win a championship, we'd be very happy competing like the Raptors were, who are consistently players in the East. I know the West is a lot harder, but I want to get your take on the Raptors. We're talking about them a little. Do you see them coming out of the East this year real quickly?
I think they might. I really think that because the Celtics have their own issues going on. I think that the Raptors. I really think that once they're probably still having a little bit of trouble figuring out how to insert Gasol and who's starting Gasol or Ibaka and all of that. But I think at the end of all of this, I think Danny Green's still an awesome perimeter defender. I think Kawhi's an amazing perimeter defender. I think Lowry's still really, really good. I think Gasol's going to wind up finding his niche with that team. I think they're going to be a force, and they got a lot of depth. And that's not even to mention Siakam, Siakam is not just some like Joe Smo player who helps the other really great players on that team. That guy's a force, and that's a good team, and they got a lot of depth too. So I think they might be. I think they're coming out the East. I really do. I think they're that good.
Yeah, Kawhi could be the difference there, and I know what you mean about Siakam. I've been paying extra attention to him this week because I'm going against him in my fantasy basketball playoffs there. And, he's been putting up some numbers. But I'll take your word for it on him being a really good player. I'll have to look into drafting him next year. Our fourth and final quarter of the show is our Best Questions segment, where we tackle your best questions. Reminder, you can tweet us your questions at BestPodcastNola using the hashtag BestQuestions, and we'll debate them live in the fourth quarter of each show. I'm sad to see AD go, but what is y'all's favorite AD moment as a Pelican?
I think it's his second year, early in the year, he played Pau Gasol, and he just absolutely dominated him. I want to say it was the first time he had scored more than 30. He had 32 points that night, 12 rebounds, 3 assists, 1 steal, and then 6 blocks. But he made Pau Gasol complains, and he complains in a way that's really, really funny to me. And Pau Gasol was complaining so much. I think he was wanting more calls or whatever. But AD made him look so bad that game, and that was just like, Pau Gasol is a really good player, and I remember watching that and being like, this is his second year. It's very early in the year. Not only I thought we had something special in him before that, but that was sort of one of those moments where I thought, okay, this is not just a promise thing. Like, this guy actually is going to be what we thought he would be.
Right, and Pau Gasol was probably in his prime of his career during that point, and that was that was 5 years ago or something like that. And it really did kind of show you what AD was really going to be about here in New Orleans. And for the most part, he's really lived up to that. My favorite moment for him was a specific play. I was watching TV in my little New Orleans house in law school, and they were playing the Oklahoma City Thunder. And I was really into the Pelicans when I was in law school because it was so easy to go to these games on like a Tuesday or Wednesday night for $10 or something, and so I would go to a lot of the games, and I was really into the Pelicans. We were fighting for the playoffs in 2015, and we were playing the Thunder, who were also fighting for the playoffs. And the score was tied with about 1.5 seconds left or something like that. And AD hit this double clutch 3-pointer fadeaway at the buzzer and just kind of walked off the court like, yeah, I'm the man. And it was awesome. That's kind of my most vivid memory of AD. I know a lot of people really enjoyed his playoff series last year when he was dominating, but I would argue that the play of Jrue Holiday and Mirotic kind of not overshadowed AD because AD was awesome in that series too, but just kind of that was the one play though, that Oklahoma City game, probably 3 or 4 years ago, that I just never will forget, honestly.
Yeah, I did think that AD was clearly the best player in that Portland series, but I get what you're saying about Mirotic and Jrue, because that was kind of Drew's coming out party in particular. Like, we all knew how good Jrue was, but I think the rest of the NBA was not quite as aware of it, especially its fans. And you can even go back to that first playoff series that he had against Golden State. when we didn't win a game there, but we were competitive, and that was, I mean, AD was, no, he wasn't the best player on the floor or anything like that, but I thought that they had a lot of trouble with him, and that was Draymond Green, who was an excellent defender, and they didn't know how to handle him, and that was pretty cool to see too. But yeah, a lot of good moments. It was really, I wish AD well, and obviously I don't want him playing or getting hurt, but I do appreciate what he's done here.
And that's the end of our fourth quarter. If you like what you heard, make sure you become one of our best friends by subscribing to this podcast and giving us a great rating on iTunes. You can also follow us on Twitter @BestPodcastNola. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you to our sponsors. We'll be back next week. Tell all your friends. Who dat?